You know, I've been coming here for 9 years now, and I've gotten to the point where even if there isn't a discussion, I just come for the videos. I mean, they're fantastic. Good morning. My name's Tom Clark, and we are here to discuss Friends. First of all, I just want to say, because it is the 9th year that I've been here and watched how this forum has grown in importance and significance for all of us, not just in North America, but around the world. And I just want to thank Peter von Prague for having me back here again and again and again. It's a terrific honor for me. No one disputes the importance of alliances or allies, not at all. But increasingly we are asking the question, what is that alliance? What are allies supposed to do and how are they supposed to interact? Janice Stein put it really well in the essay she wrote on this for the Halifax papers. And with apologies to Janice, I'm going to shorten it down to simply this, that alliances used to be about relationships, and now they are becoming, in the view of many, more transactional, an issue-by-issue alliance, which changes the very nature of how we get along. We've had our exposure to the new idea of alliance. We got hit with what are called 232 tariffs by the United States on aluminum and steel. And what that means in ordinary language is that we represented a threat to the security of the United States. Trust me, as Canadians, we were pretty proud of that moment. We thought that was pretty damn good. But you know, other smaller allies like us are sort of wondering too, what is the new landscape? What is the new world that we have to work in? And, listen, let's admit that the United States has a very legitimate and long-standing view about one of our greatest alliances, NATO. They're always badgering us to pay up. We're always going to the washroom when the bill arrives, but that's fine too. And so in that sense, the Trump administration is not saying anything that the Obama administration did not do. But it's gotten to the point where, as we all know, Emmanuel Macron of France is now saying that NATO is brain dead as a result of the withdrawal, spiritual or otherwise, of the United States from that alliance, and says that Europe is at the tipping point now of having to redefine where it stands in the world and where it's going to go. Enough from me. I have 5 extraordinary people, all with completely different views on this topic. And if they dare agree, I will step in and tell them otherwise. Their bios are in your books, and I highly recommend that you read them because these are all extraordinarily accomplished people. I will start at the far end, and the chief of the defense staff of Poland, General Andrzejczak.
Sounds good.
I have tried so hard to get that right. But the nice thing is that when he was in Afghanistan, he went by the call sign White Eagle 6. And if you, sir, don't mind, I will call you White or Eagle or Mr. Eagle for the rest of the...
White Eagle 6 is good.
Or General Eagle to me, yes, exactly. Sir Michael Arthur, who is the head of Boeing International, 30 years in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So he comes by diplomacy and the understanding of alliances, not only from a diplomatic point of view, but more importantly to this discussion, from a business point of view that is integral, I think, to the future of alliances. Senator Tim Kaine, a great friend of not only this conference, but a great friend of Canada's, and always terrific to have you here, Senator. Thank you very much for coming. We have Falah Mustapha Bakir, who is a senior policy advisor to the president of the Kurdish regional government, who joins us today. Thank you very much. And finally, Yong, have I butchered that? I've got a very strong Polish accent, so I may have... From Singapore, and even though you walked me through it, I won't even try and pronounce the school that you are in charge of. But it's very important and very influential. The school?
Rajaratnam School of International Studies.
Okay, so now you understand why I took the route I did.
But we use acronym in Singapore, so just call it RSIS.
RSIS, okay. Senator Kaine, I want to begin with you. The nature of shifting alliances, inevitably, all roads in that discussion lead back to Washington, D.C. When you take a look at even the fact that we're having this discussion now, are you worried about the nature of the shift in the alliance and how the United States is being viewed in that context?
I'm absolutely worried. So you might think, and you'd be right, that because I was on the ticket that lost to President Trump, I'm not in the maximum agreement with the president on everything. But there are many things the Trump administration does that I strongly support. There are great people, great appointees who've been before Secretary of the Navy sitting right here in the front row. The thing about the administration, though, that I am the most worried about, I don't think the president gets the allies thing. I don't think he gets the allies thing. Questioning NATO, pulling out of the Paris Accord, which we worked with allies, pulling out of the Iran deal that we worked with allies, but backing away from the Kurds. We'll have this discussion in a way that did something very rare in Congress. It actually unified Democrats and Republicans in Congress when that announcement was made. But the one that in some ways was the most startling was using the national security waivers against Canada and the EU. We had used those waivers against Libya and Iran. I have seen Canadian troops fighting side by side with American troops in Erbil. I have seen EU wounded warriors getting treated at the Landstuhl Hospital in Germany who were fighting side by side with American troops. My son is a Marine who's deployed with NATO troops on the border of Russia. And you just don't call an ally with the longest undefended border in the world, you don't call them a national security threat. If you've got a trade issue with them, then there are all kinds of mechanisms that you can use to deal with that, discussion and other things and tariffs, but you don't call them a national security threat. It was insulting. It was insulting. And I just feel like it's part of a general weakness of the president. It's not shared by members of the administration to a large degree, but I just don't think we get it. Now, you posited our alliance is shifting from relationship-based to transactional. Let's at least put a third possibility out there, values-based. So they can be relationship-based, they can be transactional, they can be values-based. They're probably going to be a mixture of all three, right? I don't think you can just put them all in one camp. But I do think this is something we've given our allies cause to worry. The president prides himself on unpredictability. That has been part of what he has done to advantage in his private life, and there's value in being unpredictable. But usually the unpredictable partner, that's a way for a junior partner to sort of get above their weight a little bit, be unpredictable. I don't think that's what the global superpower should do. I think the face we should project to the world is count on us. You can count on us. We'll be there for you. And I don't think we're projecting that right now.
Which leads me to General Andrzejczak. You are among the panels, although Falah, you may be somewhat in the same position, but in a very real way, you are one phone call away from having to know exactly what your alliance is with NATO, with the United States and others. And you don't have a lot of time to think. When you've watched, as you have over the past couple of years, the nature of the relationship between the Trump administration and Vladimir Putin, who clearly is the biggest existential threat to your country and why you're in uniform. How do you game that out? How do you have to adjust your thinking with the shifting sands of this alliance?
So, well, the Halifax, this is White Eagle 6, the report is coming, if you want to. In the very beginning, the biggest challenge for me is to shift a little bit from the main topic since yesterday, which is Far East and the China mentioned many times. So NATO alliances with NATO was built a couple of years ago, and probably when we think NATO, the first thing comes to your mind is the NATO from the Cold War. But the question is, we're still talking about the same NATO. It was completely different dimension, completely different threat, different situation. However, the geometry, the geostrategical location is still the same. Couple of differences is we changed the shape of NATO, changed the relations, changed the borders. So NATO is a little bit closer to the Russia today. And the question is, the vocabulary, do we still talking about the same NATO we mentioned? And the second thing is, just before we go and criticize or to be skeptical or have some very hard arguments, is asking ourselves about whether we're doing what we expect to do concerning the strength of alliance. So for Poland, as you said, there's no time. There's a fight tonight philosophy. So our strategy is to build a national capacity, a national capability to be credible and to be kind of, I would say, an energizer for other countries in the NATO, what we should do to be ready tonight.
I want to come to Sir Michael in a minute, but because we're talking about the shifting nature of alliances, Falah, the Kurds have had a rather interesting experience with the shifting nature of alliances. Let's make very clear, you're with the Kurdish regional government, so we're not talking about Syria and Turkey and everything that's happening there, but nevertheless, you got friends over there. In terms of your own experience within Iraq, and what you expected and what you got, was there a big difference between those two?
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed. The problem is that we are worried, living in the Middle East, we all need leadership at the global level. The US is supposed to lead the free world, and there are certain institutions that are there in order to help. But do we have these institutions ready to implement? Are they the right tools for today's challenges? The United Nations, NATO, the European Union, the Arab League of Arab States, or the non-aligned movement, all of them. Are they fit to deal with the challenges of today or not? For us, we are worried. We want predictability and not unpredictability. We live in a tough neighborhood. We want to secure a better future for the people of Kurdistan region in Iraq. Our aspirations and demands have not been met with Iraq and implementing the constitution. We've been fighting for that, and we have waited from 2003 until now. The same issues are still outstanding there. But what's going to happen, we don't know. That's why it's about leadership at the global level. It's about the international order. We very much want a rules-based and values and principles-centered partnerships. I will call it partnerships, not only relationship, because we have something to offer. Kurdistan region was a partner with the global coalition, although that was recognized locally when they would come to Erbil. But internationally, we were not sitting at the table. Sometimes we were on the table to be discussed. So that's the difference. So we wanted to be sitting at the table, part of that coalition. We were in a front line that was 1,100 kilometers long. We have paid 2,000 Peshmergas who have paid the ultimate sacrifice, 10,000 wounded. And we were partners with this coalition. But that was not recognized fully. We opened the doors and borders of Kurdistan to host nearly 2 million IDPs from the rest of Iraq and refugees from Syria. Today, we had 1.1 million still there, but as a result of the recent events in northeastern Syria, we have 17,000 who have crossed the border. But if the operations will continue, that number will go away. Therefore, we are worried about the alliances. What does it mean to be an ally? With alliances comes responsibility. Okay, we have to have a guideline. This is your role, this is your responsibility, but it's not clear. The Kurds in Syria, the Kurds in Iraq, we were partners in the global coalition to fight ISIS. But we are seeing that what happened in Kurdistan region of Iraq 2 years ago after the referendum, we were left alone. And just last month, we have seen the Syrian Kurds facing the same thing. What does it mean to be an ally with the most powerful nations of the world and with democracies?
Mm-hmm. Sir Michael, you've got a very unique view on all of this, not only from your background as a diplomat at a very interesting time in the 80s, late 80s when the world changed, but where you sit right now as the president of Boeing International, let's put a business patina on this, because it seems to me, and forgive me for putting words into your mouth, but I'm sure that you'll tell me if I'm wrong, that either creating new alliances or redefining what an alliance is cannot be done simply through military and diplomatic means anymore. It has to include international business because that's just the lifeblood of the world right now. But give me your perspective on it.
Well, thank you, Tom, and congratulations on getting my name easy. That was the easy bit. It may struggle with my accent now, but we'll see how we go on that. You're spot on. I think as we look at this new architecture of the world and the intergovernmental stuff that is not going quite as people want, global business has to be at the table. We are increasingly just part of that architecture. And if you look at how the world is increasingly interconnected now, it's business that's making that happen, and that's for the good. I mean, let's face it, the world being more interconnected, everybody's better off. We help set some of the standards globally on that. Business works for that. The values that we put out as we have global supply chains, all that's part of the sort of soft architecture that underpins what you're talking about for the hard architecture. So I think we genuinely have a big role to play in this debate going forward. If you translate that to the more defence area that we're talking about on this panel, I mean, in the short and proximate terms, NATO looking at the issues you talked about, General, that relationship between business and government is changing too. I mean, when I was doing defence policy inside government, business was some way away. And nowadays, as you struggle to get 2%, and then what do you get with your 2%, it's not just about buying shiny toys. I mean, I know generals love shiny toys, but actually what you can do with those, the availability, readiness, capability, through-life support, spares, all that stuff, increasingly, companies like ours are working hand in hand with governments to help you deliver. So that sort of partnership between business and government is evolving quite fast. And we talked yesterday about the wider spectrum of the next generation of technologies. I mean, here again is a really interesting example with NATO. In NATO now, you're looking out at sort of 20 years ahead, what will command and control and surveillance, sort of AWACS stuff, be like? And nobody really knows the answer. And so for the first time, perhaps not the first time, but quite an early example of this is NATO is now talking to industry to look at helping to get us scope the problem before we look at scoping your solution. And that's a very healthy business to government type of reaction. Third example occurs to me, looking at new technologies. We talked yesterday quite a lot about new technologies, AI, biotech's another one. These are going to require new global rules. And I don't know how we get there with those, but we, the business community, have to be part of that definition and sort of mapping of the rules going forwards. Otherwise, there'll be anarchy. Space, another good example. I mean, space now, more and more activity going on in space, and the lines between commercial and defense are getting blurred. And it's becoming a sort of coalition of the capable rather than coalition of the willing. And you see a number of governments looking at that, a number of key companies doing that, and that partnership between us and them is very much part of how we will go forward. So company-to-country partnerships is one of the new elements in the global architecture. It doesn't replace government-to-government partnerships, but it's an added point to it.
Can I just add one, because this was the point of Nancy's talk last night. One of the points was the new role for companies in helping us figure this out. And one of the positives of it, role of companies and transnational corporations, you could argue some negatives, but here's a positive. Lise asked Phil Davidson in the last panel, is it a new Cold War? We want to take it out of the war scenario. The more you include businesses and the economy, you take it out of a war scenario, and it's certainly a competition, and it's a competition with high stakes, but we'd rather have the definition of the challenge that we face not lead with a military edge, as was the case during the Cold War. So I sort of like the economic players because it gets us out of the purely military way of thinking about these issues.
Professor Yong, let me come to you for a second. This is the only panel so far at the forum that has not concentrated on China, so I'm glad you're here.
But I'm from Singapore.
You're not part of any military alliance, although you're the guy that we keep on inviting to the party anyway, even though you're not a member. But from your perspective in Asia, we're seeing right now the strains on the alliances, formal or otherwise, before our eyes. We see it happening in Hong Kong. We see it happening in terms of how we deal with China, and I guess to a degree North Korea. give me the Asian perspective on from where you sit on where we are on that journey of redefining what alliance is and whether it's a good thing or a bad thing.
Well, first of all, I think we have to talk about interest, yeah? Whether you are a friend or you are a special partner or an ally, you go back to basic thing called interest. And in this debate that is going around, I think people have forgotten what is their main interest or what are their main interests. And as a student of diplomacy and international relations, I was brought up to understand that interests are permanent. Friends can change, relations can change. But what you are doing in a particular part of the world is based on US interests, national interests, commercial interests, perhaps people-to-people interests. But I thought that the developments in the last 30 years since China has become a significant economic player has been that things have changed because China has become a new economic powerhouse. But at the same time, there are also changes with regard to technology and the way we do things. Yeah. Yet, I thought that the interests of United States or any one of us here on this panel would be quite permanent. Yeah. We can have new friends. That video you mentioned just now about those friends in New York, among them you actually can see some are closer to one another and some are just making do with the other guy. Yeah. But it goes back to interests, and we are in a transitional stage. If we don't recall what are our interests, and we just go by the circumstances or the day-to-day issues, then we are going to put our friendship, partnership, whatever relationship in great jeopardy.
I just want to tell everybody here, feel free to jump in on any of the points because there's a lot. But General, if I could just lead the sort of free flow here a little bit. You know, you were talking about how it feels from our side in terms of trying to figure out where that new relationship is. You and I were talking earlier about what would happen in reality if there was a small little incursion into Poland or a small little incursion into Lithuania or Estonia, and somebody said, Article 5, we need Article 5. Would people actually show up for that? I mean, I think that's a real question that people have. Now, whether Article 5 is something that would actually happen unless, you know, it's only been invoked once before, and that was by the United States. But at the same time that we're thinking about all this, the Russians are thinking about it as well, right? They're gaming it out every bit as much as we are. So from where you sit, this is sort of almost a bit of a psychological game too, isn't it? Because the Russians are, and I don't want to lead you on this, but it would seem to me that they're sort of feeling about how far they can go and which buttons they can push on you.
So definitely, I would say that being Russian is not nationality, it's a state of mind. That's what we feel every single day. But I will refer a little bit for a discussion since yesterday we discussed the values. And we're comparing values, something which is not in the store. You cannot buy freedom, you cannot buy simply values. And we're talking about money, just resources. We're talking about a business, which is also natural. That's the world we live in. And we have to agree that the values we're representing and values we're defending are understood in the same way into alliance. And the second thing is this industry, is a business, so security is not for free. And we have to understand that you have to invest, you have to pay certain money, put in your budget. So balancing between the values that we have to defend, something which is unmeasurable a little bit, and something which is you can calculate easily in your budget is critical. What we present in Poland is we take security seriously. We're living where we're living. Poland, geographically, geostrategically, is still in the biggest highway. It is a kind of a crossroad of everything. It's a highway from Moscow down to the Warsaw, Poznan, and then to the center of Europe, and across Atlantic is just across to Poland. And the same from the Baltic states, the second line of communication from Tallinn down to the Black Sea, and Poland is in the middle. So we're taking security seriously, investing huge money, 2% of GDP invested right now. We have 3 divisions, 4 is being built, 5th multinational ready to go, already certificated, buying certain capability. So that's our inspiration for others what to do, talking about the security. In Article 5, if we don't believe, it means that we are weak. It's exactly what you said. The Russians, they playing the game, they're knowing exactly that they're taking a piece of the ground, which is approached from a different, from a past, the understanding of a conventional conflict, will be not enough to push a button, but it will be absolutely too much to accept it. So in Poland, there'll be no question. So I don't care, about and I'm not afraid about the approach of Poles, because we are absolutely, from a historical context and also the locations and architecture of our society, there'll be no question marks. No single matter, taken by anybody. But the question is about our responsibility to take a role of original leader, and what happened if in the Baltic states, piece of the ground will be taken. So what we do is absolutely sending a strategical communication or level of determination, even if there will be a flavor of a bilateral, trilateral relations. As I said, there's no option, there's no alternate construct. What we're building is more about investing and presenting example what to do for a future for another NATO members, so definitely.
Sir Michael.
I was going to pick up slightly where the general's now taking us. I mean, it seems to me if you've got a physical incursion into territory, public opinion sort of sees that and is happy to respond. It's a societal challenge for us. But increasingly, some of the threats to us are cyber threats, and they're not very transparent, and there's not very easy ways to identify where the origin is, but it hurts and it matters to society. So how do you get Western democracies to really gear up to face that challenge? And when they do, if they do, what's your trigger for response? And I think this, because of the technology, has to be, again, a partnership between governments and the private sector, particularly the digital private sector. And it's a really challenging political issue, this, how you get acquiescence.
So I was talking about interests, and given the number of countries around the world, different powers, we basically go back to managing all these different interests. And what we have in the world today is a rules-based order, and the biggest challenge now in the digital domain is how do we agree on norms and rules of governance with regard to the digital domain. And up to now, unfortunately, we have not yet been able to agree. And this is a difficult part, because at the UN, we've been talking about this for 2-3 decades already, because different countries have different interests. And now you want to frame a set of new rules governing the management of data, the use of technology. All these will be new game, and which make it very of great interest to countries like China, Russia, and they know that the one way they can get in is to determine how the rules of engagement are, and if there are any dispute, if there are misuse of any of the technology, what do you do? And this is the reason why we have so many problems today in the world, because the newer powers, as I call them, are not willing to follow the methodology used in framing the rules and governance regime in the past.
Although the discussions yesterday and today have identified these domains, so digital, navigation, space, where it really doesn't work if there aren't agreements. I mean, just use space as an example. We're all putting more satellites in, could be for radio, getting my Sirius XM radio, or weather observation, or military. The more we put into space, if there aren't rules, you end up with collisions, you end up with jeopardizing investments. Somebody who can't have a space program can create debris in space that jeopardizes everybody's investments. There's no way to deal with space as a domain without a rules-based system. You can't just have everybody doing what they want. That jeopardizes everyone's investment. So some of the new domains are challenging us, but they're also sort of demonstrating that we can't do that without creative alliances and multinational agreements.
So,
What about
Senator,
this? Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
I just want to pick up on the data point. I mean, you touched on a really important issue about how we handle personal data. And even within the West, we find differentials there. But let's not all be negative about it. I mean, the flip side of that is that with AI and increasing amount of data in the world, we are improving global economy. I mean, data is gold for the future. And so we've got to not clamp down on handling of data. We have to be careful about it. We've got to use it. We make better airplanes every month because we've got masses of data coming off global airplanes. And you know, that's a positive as well as a negative.
You know, and I want to get you involved in this, and if I could just lead a little bit coming out of what everybody's been saying here, that if it is about interests, common interests and values and so on, but it isn't the old style alliances that we grew up with from 45 onwards, it does mean that countries, whether it's the Kurdistan regional government, whether it's Canada, whatever, we're being forced to take a look at other alliances, other sort of structures that are going to better reflect a transactional nature of what we need, and perhaps even on a value system. And so I'm wondering, the strains that this puts on traditional alliances, the ones that we have built an entire system around, is now forcing the members to go out and redefine who they want to play with. And I'm just wondering if that creates a real and present danger. I mean, you're in the center of it.
Well, alliances must be based on trust and credibility. And now there is a concern not only in Kurdistan region, Iraq, but in the entire Middle East. What should they expect from the alliances that they have with the United States and the West? And that's why people are going out, reaching out to other powers. It's not only China and Russia, but also Iran, Turkey, and other powers, India. So there are too many powerful nations in the neighborhood. So we are not only talking about 5 permanent members of the Security Council or the superpowers. There are regional powers which are very powerful. For the Kurdistan regional government, all our neighbors are powerful. So either the alliance is based on trust, credibility, and that can be sustained, or we have to sort out our issues with the regional powers. That's why leadership is very important, commitment is important, predictability is important, but also to deliver on that. So we need to understand each other. What do we get if we go to? Or the question is, either we are talking about one alliance or different alliances working against each other. So that's another question. So if we are to exclude some powerful nations, then these powerful nations have neighbors. They will have influence on their neighbors. We can't be talking about an alliance that does not include all. So that's why I said we have to redefine the international order, talking about the UN system. With having the power to veto any decision at the Security Council, we are paralyzed. We can't move with anything because there is one member who can stop everything. So that's why it has to be redefined.
Senator, a couple of nights ago, I was down in Washington. I was having dinner with some old friends, and I was talking about this very thing. It was an exciting dinner party. And the response I got back from her was, it's nothing personal. You know, the way the U.S. is shifting its position on a lot of things. And be patient. It will all change. So let me ask you directly, and I know that predicting the future is hard to do, but is this a temporary thing we're going through, or is this a permanent shift?
I think it's temporary. The alliances will be new, so change, of course, there's going to be change. And you could look at U.S. history on foreign policy issues and say this tension's always been there. George Washington said, avoid entanglements. Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson were, let's be global in our reach and in our diplomacy. So there are two poles in American thought, even go back to Washington a little bit, isolationist versus be engaged and be a global leader. And we go back and forth. But I strongly believe that the next president of the United States, Democrat or Republican, is going to want to significantly re-engage in multilateral institutions, treaties, not casually, criticize the heads of state of other countries in public. I mean, I think President Trump, and this is a long-standing thing, I mean, he is a bit more of an isolationist. The America First thing is really a statement of what he believes. Now, we should all put our own countries first, but I think America First works a lot better if we have friends. I mean, and I just think having friends makes you a lot stronger. What if we had not imposed these sanctions against Canada in the EU? We've been talking about China all weekend long. What if we had said, boy, China's a big threat. What can we do to get China to be more engaged in a rules-based order? Wouldn't we want to go to Canada and the nations of the EU and say, you're concerned about theft of intellectual property, you're concerned about subsidizing state industries to undercut your own, you're concerned about human rights abuses, so what's the pressure campaign we can put on if we all link arms together? Well, instead, you sanction allies and then you want to go mano a mano against China on your own. It was foolish. It was foolish. So there will be new forms of alliances and nations rise and fall, and that's just reality. But I think the next president, Democrat or Republican, is going to want to re-engage again. The challenge is when you come back into a room that you exited, you don't get to sit at the same seat. Sometimes you got to kind of re-earn it, but that's not all bad either. Sometimes we in the United States have been rightfully proud of helping create a world-based order. We didn't have to do it. Our economy was the biggest. Our military was the strongest. We were a diplomatic nation. We could have just said we're on top and it'll be our way. But we did want to create a rules-based order that was good. But sometimes we want to be rewarded for having done that a half a century ago and not think about it new and re-earn. And we shouldn't use the platitudes of the past to have people pat us on the back. So we'll come back into the room and want to re-engage significantly in alliances and multilateral institutions, but we'll kind of have to restate our case for why we have something very special to offer, and that's actually maybe okay.
Ambassador, you want to get in?
Yeah, I agree with the Senator. But I think also that one of the fundamental issues in United States politics is somewhere along the line you lost your sense of security. You are feeling insecure. Who can challenge the United States of America? To come into American territory, you got to pass either the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean, and your geography is the basis of your permanent interests. But along the way now, you are fighting with the food seller on the street for a living. Yeah, that is something very unfortunate. The impression we get in Southeast Asia is that, okay, we follow the rules-based order, and international trade is the primary driving force, so we all switch on to trade-oriented business, similarly China. And now, somehow, the US feel insecure. We talk about 5G. In the old days, when I was in school in Washington, D.C., when something new came up, the Americans will say, don't worry. You are now talking about 2G, I'm going on to 3G. So I thought what should happen in the great innovative spirit of America is that, 5G, sure, you might have stolen my intellectual property, but hey, we are going on to the 6G. Try to catch up.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's the kind of security that...
confidence, right?
Confidence, yeah. That I think somewhere along the debate that you have in the United States and also at the UN, we lose track of that. So if you are the number one guy and you go into a football game thinking that you may be losing, then I think the spirit is not very helpful.
Certainly seen
I
that
think
with the
the
Packers.
China challenge is, how can we conceive of a nation that will have a larger economy than ours because the population is 5 times? I mean, as soon as the Chinese worker is 1/5 as productive as American worker, they're going to have a bigger GDP than ours. We've had the biggest GDP in the world since 1890. Probably the most powerful military since Roosevelt, as Secretary of the Navy, built up the fleet. We've been the diplomatic nation. Teddy got a Nobel for brokering the end of the Russo-Japanese War. So diplomacy, we were a leader, biggest GDP, biggest economy, most powerful military. Well, we want other nations to rise and improve. So and after World War II, there was not a close second. So much else had been destroyed. How can you accommodate the rise of others, which we should celebrate and reward without feeling a little bit like, I guess I must be losing something. And obviously people do lose things to trade, to technology. They see opportunities drifting away and they sort of blame others for it. But we have to figure out a way in the world, and this has been the way of the world for a very long time, to reward and celebrate others' improvements, but to insist upon values. And so again, I would say there's relationship-based and there's transaction-based alliances. But I think what we did this week on the Hong Kong resolution was a values-based thing. And it was interesting, in the Senate, it was a unanimous consent resolution. We just all agreed, and we do resolutions that way often, but the impact of it globally has been so powerful. And it's a good reminder to us that when we can be together on these items, it might seem inconsequential because it passed through unanimously, but it can have a really big effect, and it was values-based.
Sir Michael.
Sort of pick up on the Senator's point about this debate between nationalism and sort of multilateralism. If you look, not talking about the United States, if you go back to Europe now, what we're seeing with Brexit, and it's not just in the UK where the forces of nationalism are getting stronger, it's elsewhere in Europe too. And there may be a counterbalancing of that in the residual EU if and when Britain leaves. If you look at Turkey, if you look at India, I mean, across the world, the nation state has got a new sort of life in it as a building block. So I think as we go forward in trying to get this global rules-based system sort of re-established, the building blocks are going to be increasingly more nation states than groups of nation states. And that's just a fact of reality. You know, if I can just make a sort of Halifax point on the back of that, I mean, this is a new thinking about design of where the system goes. And in the old days, governments had those thoughts. They were the sort of thought leaders, really, of how we designed these things. That's not happening anymore. I mean, if you look in my country, why we're in Brexit is because political leaders followed rather than led. Public opinion wanted to go in a certain direction, and that's where the politicians went. I think fora like this have an increasing role in sort of thought leadership, because in this global world of digital, there's things coming from left field and from right field. Somebody needs to grip it.
But don't lose sight of the big picture. I mean, the United States of America, in composite terms, is still the #1 in the world. China may think that it has done well economically, but I think their GDP is about 60-70% of US GDP. And now China is dependent on trade, which means you have a great leverage. According to our statistics, China is the #1 trading partner for more than 130 countries of the world. So imagine if the United States of America with the UN and other partners and allies sit down and say, okay, now the rules of the game have to be adjusted in this way. I think you will have people like China and other countries, India and all that rising powers, will have to seriously sit down and, okay, let's talk. Because if they don't move the rules or the rules-based regime or the international law in a certain way, then everybody is going to suffer.
Well, people want to have confidence in the alliances. As I said, if they are not confident that this alliance will protect them and give them what they want, and at the same time, they need to have clarity of vision, clarity from those who lead the alliance, what will happen. The pivot to Asia has threatened some people, thinking as if Middle East region or North Africa or the MENA region is not an important region anymore. While the oil, the gas, the diversity, religions, everything comes from that part of the world with all its problems. Then if the US is shifting its attention to that area, of course there would be others who will fill in the gap. And we have seen the gaps have been filled by players in the region. So therefore alliances are stronger when there is leadership, clarity of vision, commitment, and also engagement. So disengagement does not help.
General.
So, interesting, since yesterday, what I observed, no matter what kind of a panel it is naturally going to China, which is interesting observation for me. I am from the center of Europe, and the question is only about the trade, only about this kind of source of threat, or if we mention for a second Russia, again, and which is not huge economy, Russia declining in the parameters in the economy, the demography, and so on. But unstable Russia in this game, even including the China, will be absolutely critical. So talking again about the alliances and the credibility of NATO, once I'm reading these strategical documents, it's absolutely clear. The threat number one, Russia. Threat number two, terrorism. So how to compare what you're talking about here in this side of the globe and about the new emerging giant of economy of China, comparing to unstable Russia, which will be first to face the biggest and the most effective alliance, which is NATO today.
Just to state that question a different way, so Putin always talks about controlled chaos, that's sort of a theme. Yeah. Imagine if it was uncontrolled chaos. I mean, so we don't like what it is now,
no option.
But if it was uncontrolled chaos, then we would be dealing with probably a multiplied
And
set
also
of
subnational or non-state actors is a different case. When you have independence, when you are a sovereign nation, you sit on the table, you engage. But for us, like Kurdistan region, we are a sub-state actor. So what about the non-state actors who are also part of that world and they want to benefit from these alliances?
And one could make the argument that Hong Kong is becoming a non-state actor as well, to bring it back to China a little bit. Michael, did you want to get in? No, okay. So,
Not on that one.
so when we get to Sir Michael having nothing left to say, it is time to go. We got the smartest people in the world in this room. So let's open this to questions, and we'll start right here, sir, and then we'll come to you.
Thank you very much. I am Mauricio Mejulan from Mexico, and not because I am Mexican and Latin American, but from a global perspective, I believe that Latin America has been absent of some of these discussions, especially when we speak about allies. For example, if we're talking about trade, Mexico is #1 trade partner to the US. So what about including Latin America in this discussion? What would be your take on this, especially Senator Kaine, who I know you care a lot about Latin America?
Yeah, it's interesting. In the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, my observation when I joined it was that, you know, our history, our foreign policy history has had an east-west axis, but not really a north-south axis. And our attention to America's issues has been very episodic. And even when we do pay attention, it's often we're paying attention because of an east-west axis, the Monroe Doctrine. We don't want European nations to be too involved in the Americas, or during the Cold War, we don't want the Soviet Union to be too involved in the Americas. So often our policy toward the Americas has really been driven by the east-west axis rather than north-south. If you think about how do we match up, my vision, how do you match up with a China with 5-6 times the population? Well, we got 1 billion plus in the Americas. And we all go by the name Americans, and we have deep cultural connections. And so from a trade standpoint, et cetera, you might argue the best strategic play for the United States, if we wanted to really think about alliances in the future, would be to try to do, you know, Patagonia to the Yukon and have more significant alliances there. But we're not spending the time doing that. The Kennedy administration began it, but it didn't really percolate through into the Johnson administration. And we've not had a persistent, sustained focus on the Americas because the Secretary of State is always flying east-west around the world rather than north-south. And that's a gap. And I think that, but it's also a real opportunity for us. And look, we in the films yesterday, look what's going on in stresses in Venezuela, stresses in Chile, stresses in Bolivia, stresses in Nicaragua. There's a lot of threats and reasons we should be paying attention, but 1 billion plus people who we all go by the name Americans, North, Central, and South, there's real opportunities there for us.
Michael, you want to
Just a quick one. I made the point earlier about global business being part of the global architecture. Well, we're very far on with a very exciting joint venture with Embraer in Brazil to bring them into that global business framework.
Yeah. There's a lot of questions, so I'm going to bundle. So the two of you start off. We share a microphone just down here. And brevity is key to everything. Come right down and yeah.
Very good.
How much is the phone? How much is this worth to you? Joe Joffe from the great state of Bavaria. I hate to do this. I hate to say something reassuring about Trump and NATO. You know, we know he's been bullying them, he's been threatening, pay up, pull out. And I would make a pitch, and I wonder whether others would disagree or agree, for distinguishing Trump's rhetoric from his realpolitik. 3 instances. 1, the Obama administration reduced troops in Europe. Trump has increased them by about 5,000. Last year we had the NATO exercise Trident Juncture, the largest exercise ever of NATO as far as I remember, and with 20,000 US troops and heavy equipment. Next year we will have pretty much the same thing again 20,000 US troops plus material, practicing defensive capabilities, reaction speed, where it matters most, namely in Eastern Europe. So, here's the question. Should we distinguish between his rhetoric and his realpolitik? Is he still in the business of defending the US most important asset in the strategic arena?
I want to ask a slightly different question. Michael Arthur said at one point that he thought that the building blocks were going to be more the nation state in the future than the global alliances. Question. If that's the case, to what extent, and Senator Kaine, I'd be very interested, if you don't mind, in your reaction in particular, to what extent do you believe that the ability of a government to give good leadership depends upon the domestic scene and the extent of domestic tranquility and satisfaction in society? And I'm thinking of, in what we've been trying to tackle in the UK, inadequate educational systems, inadequate differences of wealth and benefit between regions, such as to create a degree of dissatisfaction and discord, which actually is feeding populism. How much is the domestic agenda linked to the ability really to lead?
And finally, we'll get the microphone here.
Good question.
Yeah, it is.
Good morning still. I'm Eleanor O'Sullivan. I'm the commander of Cybercom in the Netherlands. I think the concept of Five Eyes has proven its value up till now. I do think that looking to the future, space and cyber, you might want to reconsider if the concepts of the past will still be the best solution for the answers. I would be very much interested in your take on that.
Terrific. Well, wow, there's a lot to chew on there. Actions versus words, in the case of our friend from Bavaria. The good lady brings up the point about how much of the new alliance is based on domestic considerations. I hate to shorten it down, but I think that's it. And when we're talking about value-based systems, and if we're looking at values, how much values are common when the domestic situations can be so different. And then finally, your point, maybe modernization ain't a bad idea because we're not using ... anymore, and trying to update the whole thing anyway. So I throw that all out there. And General, why don't you? And we'll be brief because we do want. There's so many questions here.
Yeah, I would just take briefly the first question about the differences between what we say and what we do. What I really admire what the American Army is doing is a very pragmatic approach. So they realize that the projection of force is not effective anymore since they withdraw the troops. So the exercises, what we observe from one side, are very practical. We have to practice the cross-Atlantic deployments and then all of the complicated military issues, as well as we communicate to the Russians that the level of determination and effectiveness is absolutely high. So where we see the Zapad exercise and concentration of big numbers of troops very close to the border of NATO, especially Poland and the Baltic states, there's no other way, no options. So a very pragmatic approach of the American Army, what to do. The same, the investments in the infrastructure in Poland and so on. But sometimes what I heard, the narratives and the very different comments of the high-level politicians is a kind of waking up procedure. So sometimes we can say, if we agree, we're paying 2% GDP, We do. So it's a kind of maybe controversial, but sometimes it works for a system properly, saying that we have to invest heavily, even if we don't like that kind of comments. So that what I would like to say.
So I'd love to just be, so I think you do make a point. The president's actions are often contrary to rhetoric, but often they're consistent with his rhetoric, and his rhetoric is harmful. And so why, browbeat Merkel or Theresa May or, do some of the things he's doing? So, or the pullout of the Kurds is that's real. So, but I think there's some good points there. This issue, the domestic agenda, is the absolute key to it. 5 years, when I first started coming here, I was most worried about non-state terrorism. Then, a couple of years ago, I started worrying about great power competition and the other great powers. Now I'm worried about us, and it's this self-confidence issue. I'm worried about us, all of us, the democracies. I don't think the democracies are making a great case for ourselves. I think the authoritarians have decided not only to say, leave us alone, we want to do it our way. They're now saying, and oh, by the way, our way is actually a lot better than yours. Go back and read the Sources of Soviet Conduct, the George Kennan Foreign Affairs piece from 1947. And if you just substitute authoritarian nations for Soviet Union when you read that, he has this conclusion that, what they most want is to say that the democracies are weak and it's a decaying governmental form. And if the democracies show that they're capable of dealing with their own internal problems and make investments and move forward, and they can handle the contradictions of different parties, that's what's destabilizing to authoritarians. What is Russia really worried about in Ukraine? That Ukraine will be a small d democracy with an open economy, because then that will show everybody across the border in Russia, why can't we have that? How come we have to be under the thumb of these thugs? They're most worried about us being successful in our own domestic agenda. And so actually that is the most important thing I think we can do, is project that confidence about the model that we have.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in here. This alliance is about to break up. So just before we self-immolate here, I'm going to bunch as many comments as I can. Please keep them brief so that we can get to as many as we can. And we'll start here. I think there's two over there. Roland, you'll get in, just because I know who you are, so if that works. Go ahead, sir, and as briefly as you can.
Senator Kaine, Jack James from Washington, D.C. I have to ask the question about the elephant in the room. You just mentioned the domestic issue. Mm-hmm. You're about to be a juror in a trial. This country is split down the middle, and to some extent, the rhetoric versus reality question is going to play into that. Mm-hmm. How are you going to bind this nation up once this is over?
Thank you. Yes, sir, right behind you, just for convenience.
Hello, Ben Roswell from the Canadian International Council. Thanks for great discussion. In 2017, Ivo Dalder and James Lindsay, the Council on Foreign Relations, wrote a provocative piece in Foreign Affairs suggesting that the other liberal democracies might need to take up the leadership of our mutual collaboration in the absence of U.S. leadership under President Trump. Some did. Germany, France, Canada, and a bunch of others ended up creating the Alliance for Multilateralism. The reaction from the Trump administration was, well, this seems to be kind of an alliance against us. So my question, particularly for Senator Kaine, is for those of us liberal Democrats that do care about the future of our collaboration, if we take your hopeful point that this current administration is an aberration, the United States will return to caring about allies and wanting to build on the alliance, is there any scope for us, non-American liberal democracies, to make any advances, or do we simply need to wait for the end of the Trump administration?
Okay, I want to get in a few more, and before I go to Roland, my bias is showing. If there's a woman who would like to speak, please. Can we give a microphone over there and then over to Roland? And yes, you too. Okay, so three more.
Thank you. I'm Rita Manchanda. I'm a human rights activist, researcher. I've heard in this panel values, predictability, transactional. Values, you're talking about Hong Kong as the symbol of the alliance asserting its force in terms of freedom. I would like to also then question, why is it when it's in fact only China that the alliance stirs, or America stirs? Why not on Kashmir? Yes, there is a strategic alliance with India, with the US. Is it then so transactional that you don't talk about anything that is happening inside the country where it may actually implode? There is a very real possibility of a war between India and Pakistan because, frankly, there are no exit strategies on the horizon.
All right,
And I would like to ask, therefore, what predictability?
Okay, Ed, fair enough. Microphone here, and then we're going to Roland. Yes, ma'am. Microphone here.
Hi, Lisa Kaplan. I'm the founder of Alethea Group, which detects and mitigates instances of disinformation. And in thinking about some of your comments around the increasing role of private sector and business in order to be able to better work together to combat some of these threats, both as nation states but also as non-state actors, and specifically the technology sector. Can you talk a little bit more about what that looks like, especially in the cyber realm and space and some of these new areas that we're trying to address?
All right. I did promise Roland, and then we're done.
Thanks, Tom. Roland Paris from the University of Ottawa. Question for Senator Kaine about your remarks about post-Trump. And I'm inclined to agree, and I certainly hope that there'll be a kind of reversion to the mean in U.S. foreign policy. But about the effects of the Trump presidency on U.S. politics, including the effects on attitudes among Republican voters, where we've seen really significant shifts in attitudes towards Russia, attitudes towards trade, maybe even attitudes towards alliances. Is he salting the ground for internationalism?
All right, so my job now, because I've got Peter Van Praag looking at me in a not very friendly way, is distill whatever you want to distill out of those. Most of those questions, not surprisingly, were for you, Senator.
So White Eagle, what do you think?
Well,
how about if we just go in order, and we'll start with the
we really do have to wrap up, so as quickly as we could.
Just referring to some of the questions about the cyber, which is interesting, not typical, and with a question for armor officer. When I grew up, there was no cyber, but the composition of today's panel is absolutely perfect. There's only one man in uniform, so it means the security is not only the Army's business, and the trust and building the architecture of discussion, what really do and what kind of assets we should use. Probably taking out ourselves from a comfortable zone, because what we're talking about, the values, freedom, the security will challenge a little bit those areas. So I think it's absolutely perfect composition. So a little bit of military flavor and a multi-domain approach.
Sir Michael, a quick word from you.
Pick up on the technology point. Really, you're spot on the issue. There's not a one-sentence answer to that. Governments often know that the problem is there, but the private sector technologists are just that one step ahead in finding what the solution is. One other thing where they've got to work together is setting the rules for the future. So 6G, if you get into the committees setting the global rules for 6G, and they aren't set the right way, that's dangerous too. So it has to be a partnership.
I'm going to jump over you, Senator, because I'm going to come back to you at the end.
Darn.
But Falah, one point that you want to make in 30 seconds or less.
Well, in fact, we in Kurdistan region, we're proud to be partners with the United States, with Canada, and the global coalition in the fight against ISIS. That builds strong partnership with Kurdistan region, but we want that partnership to continue and for our partners to be committed so that we can deliver. We're trying to build a democracy in the region. We are a tolerant people, that we're proud of the culture of tolerance and peaceful coexistence, where Muslims, non-Muslims, Kurds and non-Kurds are living together in peace, and we want to be a model for the rest of Iraq. So we want your engagement with us so that we can deliver and show the rest of the world that partnerships and alliances can be successful and can produce something good.
Ambassador, quickly.
Yes, I think the important thing is to look at how we re-engage our respective population, because social media and citizen journalism is now the norm. Secondly, I think we need to go beyond current trade contestation. Technology is one part of this trade contestation, yes, but as I mentioned earlier, why we focus on 5G? 5G only make you 30 seconds faster. We should go to the next level. But more importantly, I think we need to think about what the existing rules and the international order has given us. It is not bad. Now there are almost 200 countries in the world and we still operate in a manner that allow us to fly from Singapore to Halifax. So we need to really not give up on the good things that this existing rules-based order has given us. There are problems, yes, but I don't think they are so critical that we give up everything that we already know. Engage China because they now have a good reason to be in. Thank you.
I should just point out the only way you can get from Singapore to Halifax is in a Boeing plane, not an Airbus. They don't go that far. Senator,
so liberal democracies and then the impeachment question. And the liberal democracy question was one that you were asking too that we didn't get to, so I'll put those two together. I do believe the next president, Democrat or Republican, is want to re-engage in the more, both in words and action, in sort of global institutions. And I actually think that does give an opportunity. Right now, I don't think liberal democracies should wait. I think liberal democracies should up their game in these institutions. I mean, you know, Estonia is developing a significant capacity in cyber that we're learning from. So up your game in all of these areas. And then when the U.S. is back, then we will be back in full, but maybe in a less, somebody's at the head of the table and everybody else is in different places. We'll have more pillars of strength to promote the democracy. So yeah, keep doing that, and that'll be good for all of us. The impeachment question, look, the process had to happen. The reason it had to happen is this, in a way. President Trump got as clear a warning as possible by the Mueller report. The Mueller report said, here's evidence of obstruction of justice, but a sitting president can't be indicted. And we'll look at the question of whether you as a candidate cooperated with a foreign nation to attack American democracy. We can find that Russia wanted to attack American democracy, and we can find connections between some people on your team in Russia, but we can't find evidence of an effort. But there was a clear thou shalt not in the Mueller report. You cannot cooperate with a foreign nation to subvert an American election. You can't do it. Well, that report came out, and that should have been a warning like, okay, I ducked a bullet, and there is a bright line. But instead, literally right after the report is out, now we're engaged with a foreign nation to do just that. And the four pillars of this are abuse of power by getting another nation to try to help me win an election, thwart the will of Congress that mandated that money be spent to help that nation, hurt that nation who's an ally to the benefit of an adversary, Russia. So there's these four pillars of it, and ignoring the clear thou shalt not in the Mueller report meant this had to happen. We might be jurors, Angus and me, and John Barrasso and Jim Risch. And the question of how do we both find the truth, but then ultimately heal the nation is a hard one. The Quakers have this notion, way will open. I'm waiting for the way to open on this. What is the right answer in the grand scheme of things? That I was 16 when, during the Nixon pre-impeachment and resignation, and Nixon won the election in 1972. He got 63% of the vote. And within a month after his inauguration, the Senate voted unanimously to commence this investigation. They knew the Watergate break-in didn't affect the outcome. He got 63% of the vote, but they cared about the integrity of our system enough that it was a unanimous vote to commence the investigation. And then Republicans who were very close to the president went and looked him in the eye and said, we're sorry, we're your friends, but you've lost us. And that's not going to happen this time. There's not going to be a unanimous anything. That's not going to happen. And so it is the case that the division of it, when it gets to us, we have to take an oath to weigh everything fairly and truthfully. We'll take that oath if it gets to us. We're going to have to really look hard, but also dialogue so significantly with each other to figure out what the greater good is. And I don't have an answer for that right now because I haven't taken the oath yet and I haven't seen the evidence, but it's going to, a guy like Angus, who is an independent, he's never run or won an election as anything but an independent. And then people like me, who I kind of pride myself on having good relations on the other side of the aisle, there's going to need to be an awful lot of candid discussion about how can we both honor our oath of office and the oath we take as jurors, but then what is the right answer that can not create more division in the nation, but hopefully abate it over time.
Panelists, we have single-handedly destroyed the rules-based system of the Halifax Forum. So there is that. Anyway, I thank you very much, and I thank you all very much. This panel is adjourned.
Good job, Michael. Thank you.